And so in this talk, I'm going to give you a brief overview. Well, actually, about half the talk will be based on what I did in my thesis, the high-level takeaways from that. And then the second half of the talk is going to look at some preliminary work, and hopefully it inspires you to do maybe some mechanical design in your robotics. So today I'm talking about hands in the real world. In the lab, you can select the objects you're interacting with, you can protect your robot, and you can fix it when it's broken. All those things are not true anymore when you're in an unstructured environment. And if we want our robots to do dexterous manipulation, we need our hands to be resilient because they're extended from our body. And in fact, their job is to hit the world, right? Their job is to contact the world. And so you imagine they're going to be stressed very easily with lots of very high contact forces. Okay, so first I'm going to start with the human hand because people have been inspired by the human hand for centuries. And in this system, we have a lot of moving parts. We've got input commands that result in some behavior, some motion or forces. That behavior results in information gathering, so tactile sensing from our skin. And then that combination of behavior and sensing leads to haptic understanding of the environment. And all of these are really important areas in robotic control, design, understanding of manipulation. My interest has always been in the system design. This is, how many fingers do you have? Do you have a squishy skin? What sorts of sensors have you included? And this is a system design question that will influence all of these areas of control and understanding. And so I created the Embodied Dexterity Group. And so that's like embodied intelligence is sort of the, what capabilities does the body have naturally to be well matched with what you want to do, and obviously dexterous manipulation. So one thing that we can learn from looking at the human system is that underactuation might be a good way to go when we're designing hands that are able to do many different tasks. So here's a pretty famous study, and there's been extensions of this work since then. But what they did is they looked at the way that people use their hands, the different sorts of grips that they perform, and then they did a principal component analysis and looked at the first few principal components and found that they're actually really good at describing a vast majority of the grasps that people use. So that indicates that maybe just a very small number of actuators is enough to perform a wide variety of grasps. And that's with a device that has many, many degrees of freedom. So underactuation is a useful tool. Of course, people have known this for a long time, whether intuitively or explicitly. This is a patent from 1919. I've been presenting this all year because it's exactly a century ago, so it's a lot of fun. And this is known as like the first hand patent. And it's underactuated, which is kind of cool. So here's the profile, and here's the top-down view. Here's a profile of one finger. We've got 3 joints, and we've got a single spring going through it and a single tendon. So when we pull that tendon, it curls up like this. So that's 1 actuator and 3 joints. And then when we go one abstraction layer higher, we've got 4 fingers, and they are all being actuated by a single tendon. And it shares loads between them with this like pulley device. So if one finger moves back, the others will move forward. And this is, I think, a pretty clever mechanism. So people have been pretty good at thinking about this for a long time. But of course, there are a lot of new underactuated hands. And this is a slide courtesy of Mark. This is a really nice way of describing sort of the variety of underactuated hands that we see. So we've got some that are extremely precise. Maybe it's a very low degree of underactuation. And then we have some that are really, really compliant and flexible, really good at conforming to really odd shapes. And so this is still an active area of research. And in part, it's because today we have miniaturization. We have access to new electronics. That's something we didn't have a century ago. We have computing ability. That can influence how we come up with new designs, how we do simulations. We can now have numerical models for what's going on, and we can come up with new perception and control strategies. And then finally, we have new materials. So we can come up with SORO, which is soft robotic solutions. And we can also, let's say, come up with new actuators. And so these really, I think, summarize pretty well the active areas of research that are still ongoing, and that do very much influence our creation of underactuated designs. Okay, so those designs, while probably intended for outside the lab, they are largely being tested inside a laboratory environment. So what I'm really interested in is what happens when we start to apply these in the field. There are extra challenges that we need to overcome. And compliance is really helpful because if you smash into something, you will passively very quickly get out of the way, essentially. And so we start to see a lot of underactuated designs. These are the ones that are for ocean exploration. And it's a relatively small number. And they have a lot of specialization. So this is probably the most recent one that's highly specialized. It's a very soft, noodly finger design that grips onto jellyfish. And this sort of design will only really work underwater because you have buoyancy. If you're out of the water, your fingers will sag and you won't be able to actually grasp very much stuff. But yeah, so it's a relatively small number. I think there's a lot of really rich space to explore new designs for this sort of field operation. And despite these trends, we still see that most of the grippers that are used in the field are these really simple, rigid, parallel jaw grippers. They are extremely reliable, and they will break the world before they break themselves. And that's something that really risk-adverse applications desire. But in this range here, so in the last 5 years, 5+ years, there's this big jump in the design of adaptive and soft adaptive hands. And I think it's because people are challenging themselves to apply multi-finger articulated hands outside the lab. Okay, so that pretty much gives context there. And then just to define this really clearly, if you have a fully actuated hand, you can control the degrees of freedom to either have a certain motion or force. But that's not true anymore with an underactuated design because the way that you interact with the environment changes the behavior. That means that you need to very carefully design the passive mechanism. And that leads to this like ballooning of many different solutions. So when we start to think about what our underactuated hand is going to be for a particular application, two very important elements is compliance. This is whether you use silicone rubber versus steel, and also how you distribute compliance. And here's an example of two identical hands, except the distribution of the compliance in the joints is mixed up. So two very different hands based on that one parameter. And now contact conditions, most people think of this as coefficient of friction. That's actually kind of a poor predictor of contact conditions in some circumstances. But I also think that contact location, where contact is likely to occur, that's also an important element of contact condition. Again, we have an example. We have a very slippery object, and it gets pushed out of the hand, and a very frictional object, and it remains in the hand. So that's very important. Okay. So in summary, we're very sensitive to these elements. And while we need to select them in the design of a new hand, if we're able to alter these conditions even a little bit during operation, we can now dramatically influence the behavior. So I think that if you're able to, let's say, switch a joint from soft to stiff, now you essentially have two very different hands. And so being able to adjust these during operation is a great opportunity. And underactuated hands typically are used for grasping and holding and rely on the arms to do most of the manipulation. Some people have looked at in-hand manipulation like this with underactuated devices, but it's a much smaller set of the overall work. Okay, so underactuated hands. Now I'm going to structure the talk into these two sections. The design of compliant elements into underactuated hands, in particular for ocean exploration and for the design of wearables on the human hand, and then the design and control of contact conditions. First, I'm going to talk about the Ocean One project, and then I'm going to talk about two very new projects that still have ways to go, but I think have some new interesting results. Okay, so who's heard of the Ocean One project? Everybody? I assume that Osama has given a talk at some point since you all have been here. So Osama Khatib is the director of this project, and I was lucky enough to be here when it was getting started. And his vision is to have this very intuitive avatar so that a person up on the ship can actually feel like they're in the environment, touching and interacting with it, even though it's remote. And so that's why it has this like cool humanoid form. My job was to design the hands. So I created this last little section here. And it was really fun. Right before I graduated, we actually took the robot to the Mediterranean and took it down to a shipwreck called La Lune, and we acquired a vase. And it was really scary because I knew that if these hands broke, we couldn't do anything useful. We couldn't do any manipulation, right? So the hands really cannot break, and that was a central part of the design. Okay, so back here, compliance and contact conditions. First, I'm going to talk about sort of these spring elements down here. So here's the hand design. There's a single input shaft here, and we've got 3 fingers, and each finger has 3 joints. So it's very underactuated, and we want this to be able to wrap around extruded objects, so something long and thin like a tool or a structure. But if we can't do that, we also need to be able to perform pinching, so if something is too small or too large for us to wrap our fingers around. Part of doing this is thinking about the compliance of the fingers. So here are the 3 fingers. We've got the tendons in blue, and when we pull on these, the finger will curl up. We decided to design the compliance of the flexure joints very carefully. What we did is we used this pre-tension spring to create a preload, and then as it curls, the effective moment arm decreases, and we get a nice degressive spring. It's a useful way to get very stiff behavior, but make it so that it's not too hard to close the hand. So if you're interested in learning more, read the paper. It describes it really well. What I actually want to talk about, though, is these springs down here. And this is the transmission that shares loads between the fingers. So let's think about what happens if these get really stiff. Let's say we actually make them rigid. Does anybody have any idea what that's, or a guess as to what that's going to do to the hand when you're trying to grasp onto something? Okay. It's going to mean that all of the tendons have to move in the same way. They all have to change the length, the same amount of length. So you're creating a sort of a positional constraint, a length constraint on all of the fingers. If these become really soft, infinitely soft, you go to the other side of the spectrum, and now all of the tendon tensions have to be the same. That's a force constraint. So by toggling, by changing this one parameter, the stiffness of load sharing, you go from a position constraint to a force constraint. So what do we want this to be, though? What does this mean for grasping? Well, here's an example. We've got a tube, and we're pulling it out of the hand. And you can see that there's only one finger that's resisting the pull-out. And we want to make sure that this finger can hold on as hard as it possibly can. And so we want this to be a stiff transmission, because if we're going to open this finger, we want to have to open all the fingers. We want this to be really hard to do. And you can see that in this plot, the stiff transmission in pink holds on much better than the softest transmission in blue. And it's not exactly 3 times, but you're getting approximately that order of scaling. So stiffer is better in this case, holding on to, let's say, structures and tools. There are, of course, counterexamples, though. So here, I like this one because it's, I think, pretty obvious. So you've got this water goblet, and it has this thin feature here, a stem. You want the fingers to curl and sort of interlock with that geometry in order to resist the pull-out forces in this direction. And so in this case, we see that the soft transmission in blue is stronger than the stiff transmission in pink. So just because your tendons are stiff doesn't actually mean that your hand is necessarily in its strongest configuration. Okay, so I'm not going to go into this, but empirically, given a very small set of objects, I observed that there's this trend where often we want either to have the very softest or the very stiffest transmission possible. In these cases, you can see that the intermediate stiffness in green pretty much gives intermediate performance a lot of the time. So this is not something I've proven. Probably has a lot to do with the friction and interesting things going on in the hand. So I do think this is an area for potential future research to see if this is true over a larger set of objects. But given this assumption, we decided to come up with a mechanism that did both the softest and the stiffest. So we use these torsional springs. As a torsional spring flexes, it changes its diameter. So what you can do is put hard stops or constraints around that spring to define under what loads it's going to be soft and what loads it's going to be stiff. And so when our hand is open in this beginning pose and we start to rotate the shaft to wind up our tendons, we can decide whether we're going to start soft or whether we're going to start stiff. And then if you start soft, you can still transition into stiff later if you have a hard stop on the inside. Again, if you didn't quite catch that and you're interested, the paper does talk about it. And when we were doing this in the field, I could sleep a little bit better at night, knowing that we could choose to put this in a soft mode when we needed to. So not only does the softness of the tendon give you more strength in certain circumstances, but also if you take a string like this and you shock it, that's one of the worst case scenarios for snapping a tendon. And as this finger is coming into this box, it kind of smacks down onto the top of it. And having that compliance is going to make it more forgiving. So that was one useful consequence. And then just to show that we were able to, in fact, do the pinching, here is this. And once again, we see the operator isn't really necessarily paying attention to this hand, right? So we want this to not break. We want this to be probably in the soft mode. But this one, we're lifting a heavy object with one finger. We want this one to be stiff. Okay, so that summarizes the compliant selection of the Ocean One hand. So now I'm going to move on to contact conditions underwater. This is the object that we acquired from the shipwreck, and it's covered in this really thick, slimy biofilm. And you can almost see how it feels by the way that these people are holding onto it. Right? So they're kind of caging it from all different directions. So if this was really frictional, you'd probably just hold it like this. But because it's slippery, they're kind of doing this interesting grasp. And caging is a term for sort of geometrically constraining an object, even if you have no friction. So they're sort of approximating this. One analogy would be a bar of soap that's maybe been sitting in water for a while. It's really kind of goopy and slippery. And you can see that without suction, with this particular hand, we're not able to pick it up. I guess we could put spikes on it, but now you're like spiking your soap. So instead, what you can do is add a little bit of suction flow to the fingertips, which means that the object is going to be attracted to that location, and you're able to pick it up. Now, I'm talking about a really light amount of flow rate. This is approximately how much flow rate we're talking about. So it's really gentle. And so this is not a suction cup. We don't have like a cup that's actually creating a seal. A seal could occur, but it's not necessary. Also, what we're gonna do, because this is so light, is rely on the strength of the hands and the arms to do most of the manual tasks. And we're really just using this suction flow to enhance that contact to make it a little bit easier. Now, one thing that's really nice about suction is it attracts objects to a very convenient location on the hand. So this is where I'm getting to this expansion of what contact conditions mean. Contact conditions have to do with what happens before contact even occurs. Where is that going to happen? And instead of having to fish around for this object, the object comes to us. And this was the first take. I just tossed in this neutrally buoyant object and it went to where it needed to go. Okay, so that seems a little obvious. So what about larger and more massive objects? When does this stop being helpful? Under what circumstances shouldn't we include suction? And what I really wanted to ask is, what's the role of water drag and object inertia on the usefulness of this mechanism? We didn't realize this at first, but it became obvious that this is actually a bio-inspired mechanism. Pretty much all fish use suction feeding, meaning, oh no, the video stopped. Meaning they open their mouths, they suck in water, and in with it comes the prey. That's not an evolutionary trait you see very much on land, right? Like we don't go up to our pasta and go, you know, just like expect it to come into our mouth, right? We use a fork. But being underwater, being in a denser and more viscous fluid, right, that starts to make this advantageous. So while I'm not going to go over it because it's preliminary work and I don't want to steal my students' thunder, we do have an ongoing grant looking at fish as inspiration for graspers and manipulators. Okay, So moving on to this question of what about more massive objects? What about larger objects? Well, here's a tube, and it's really far away from the center of the palm. Without suction, we have no hope. It's not going to happen. With suction, we have hope. And so if our controller isn't perfect, if we have a last-minute disturbance that we're not able to overcome, we're still going to have a chance at grasping this object. So in order to understand this better, we created a model. The dots are experimental data that we're using to validate the model. And then the lines are the models themselves. This one here, this solid blue line, is grasping underwater, where we include water drag on the object. That's in comparison to this red line, where we ignore water drag on the object. So this would be like approximately grasping in space versus grasping in a still pool of water. So actually having a little bit of water drag makes your life a little bit easier, makes your grasp region bigger. And so this is the hand, and this is the initial displacement of the object. And then when we add suction, we get an increase of about a third of our grasp region. And so we get this, again, a little bit more forgiving grasp region. So now maybe our controller doesn't have to be quite as perfect, or maybe we can go into slightly harsher environments and still grasp stuff. And once we come up with a model, we can now do some really interesting parametric studies, because those experiments were really time expensive. And here we have varying the pump parameters. So here, this blue dot, this is the line for the pump I showed you, the experimental pump that we had. And here is changing the tube mass. You can see that we get the most benefit from an increase in the pump parameters, flow rate and pressure, in this intermediate region. And so let's say we're grasping an object of 1 kilogram. We really would benefit a lot from increasing our suction parameters. If we're only grasping really, really massive objects or really, really light objects, either we want no flow or just a little bit of flow is going to do the job. So I think that's a really kind of interesting design observation, and that's what takes this from just an experimental validation to a design question. Okay, and just for fun, what if we turn the flow around? So now we're reducing our contact, we're reducing our normal force, maybe adding some lubrication, and we take this balloon, which we couldn't grasp just by squeezing, and instead now we're able to sort of push it up into the hand and successfully grasp it. Like that. And again, just because we now have suction, what else can we do with this? And in fact, if you measure the flow rate going through the tube, it's going to be clogged and unclogged as you make contact with an object and break contact with an object. And you can monitor that flow rate. So you can monitor clogging, but you also know where your orifice is located, right? So you know where that contact is occurring on your hand. So this is starting to sound like a tactile sensor. Now, tactile sensing, it's pretty much just really useful for robots. I think we all know physics pretty well, so you can all deduce that my thumb is in contact, even if you can't see that. But a robot might not be able to figure that out right away. So having some sort of touch sensing can be really helpful. But also underwater, it can be murky, or your hand could be occluded. There's a lot of reasons why you would want tactile sensing. Okay, so here we've got a fingertip. Here's where the orifice is located. It's going to curl up against the surface, and the blue line is estimating what the angle between the surface and the fingertip is. The red line is a differential pressure, because that's a differential pressure transducer that's measuring head loss across a tube, which gives us an estimate of flow rate. So as we come into the surface, we see this big drop in flow. And then as we curl up, we get these dynamic signals, kind of spikes during the stick-slip events. It saturates, and then as we come down and bounce off, we get another very dynamic signal here. So here you're getting the signal where you have sort of this nice analog, slow, steady state signal, but you also have these dynamic events superimposed on top. That's not something we've done anything with yet, but I do think it's a cool area. It's a really complex signal, which is different from a lot of sensors that you usually would want to integrate with a hand, but it's very rich. Okay, so I'm not going to go into this too much. Again, it's under review. But what we did is we started to try and validate whether this tactile sensor would be helpful for grasping. So this last summer, I had a student who looked at if you could monitor flow rate to estimate the force of pulling the object out of the hand. So we had a load cell, he came down, he grasped the object and pulled up, and then used machine learning to see if he could estimate pull-out force with suction alone. And he was actually able to do okay for a first pass. And I'm definitely thinking that this will be an area for more research to come. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that. And I think it makes sense, especially in an underactuated hand, because your hand is going to move as you pull on the object, right? You're going to get deformation. And this clog sensor is measuring a change in the orientation between the finger and the object. Okay, so that summarizes pretty much my thesis plus a little bit. So now for the second half of the talk, what I want to do is introduce some new ideas, some new projects that are ongoing, but are ready enough to show our initial observations. And the first one is still in contact conditions, but now we're handling coral reefs. We're handling pieces of coral. So how does that change what we want to do at that contact? And what we find is that blunt spines are a useful solution. Then under the umbrella of compliance, we're now designing soft gloves for people with spinal cord injury or just weakness of the hands. So how do we choose compliance such that it's helpful for the person? So let's start with the coral grasping. The Ocean One project that I showed was a pretty big platform. You need a crane, you need a team, you need a crew in order to deploy it. And even though it's much smaller than the usual standard for something like MBARI, so Doc Ricketts is this huge machine, you need an incredible amount of infrastructure. So what we want to do is enable very small vehicles, one that I could lift up on my own, to do really useful tasks like sampling coral reefs so that we can understand them better. There's a problem with small platforms though. They're really hard to control. They have less thrust, their moment arms aren't quite as large, and so they're really hard to control when you have a very turbulent environment. So this is courtesy of the Cal Academy of Science. They have this little rover with a gripper on it, and they're trying to grasp this thing. If we watched it for probably half an hour, eventually we'd kind of smash into it, break it a whole lot, and then swim away without a sample. And so this can be really frustrating. This is in comparison to people doing the same task. So here we just want a little snippet, and so she's going to come in and break off a little piece. And here we have just a little sample. That's all that we need really to do many of the biological tests. So one strategy that people can take in order to stabilize their body is to hold on to the environment. And robots can do this when the ground is flat, right? They can sit down on the ground, but they can't necessarily do that on a vertical wall. So what we want to do is create an anchor. So we have our small blue ROV2. It comes in, it grasps onto the environment in order to do a much more precise task, such as fracturing the coral, and then we can swim away with a sample. This is a multifaceted problem. So we're looking at the mechanical design of the grasper and the sampling mechanism, but there are people who are interested in the genetics. So this is Cal Academy of Science. And then we have also people who are looking at the vehicle dynamics and control of this sort of platform. And so when we want to grip onto corals, we start by looking at corals. What do they look like? And they have this, oh, and so I do want to specify, we're looking at very deep corals, ones that are in the mesophotic region. And because there's very little light, they tend to grow in these very thin, fragile plates. And so we're assuming it's going to be this plate-like structure, which means we're going to be able to pinch onto it. It's highly rugose. It has these large sort of like mountainous features, and they have a relatively regular size and shape. Now, spines make a lot of sense when you're gripping onto rugose and rough objects, such as this crab. It's got little spike feet, and it sort of hugs onto rocks. We are certainly not the first people to start looking at spines. In fact, it was spearheaded here. And so here we've got little squirrel-inspired claw feet, and then we've got spiny bot here that's able to climb. And so microspines have been around for a long time. But recent work has found that when you get really good at engaging with a surface with spines, the way they fail is actually the material breaking off. So the issue is when you're handling corals, which might be very brittle and fragile, that's going to be your failure mode. So how do you get around that? And so our hypothesis right now, given that we know the surface, is that actually blunt teeth work really well. As long as you're able to interlock with that surface, you don't want to be too sharp because you'll actually induce early fracture. So we went with this very simple 3D printed rotational spine design. Because we're doing a post-pinching, we have these sets that interlock with the surface, so we can grip onto it. We sort of do a centering behavior. And then as we swim forward, our spines open up and interlock with this surface. So we're sort of latching in this one directional way. So once we grip on in this way, once we pull backwards, we're not going to come off. Now, the choice to use rotational spines does have some consequences. One, the reason why we wanted to go with this is we said, well, whenever there's a valley, when we have a spine that's really well engaged with the surface, we want that one to squeeze harder. So if you have this constraint and you assume that it can rotate freely, you're going to have this relationship between the angle of your spike and how hard you squeeze. So once again, the spike that's down in the valley is going to squeeze harder. The problem, though, is you have this interesting singularity, and so if your angle becomes too steep, you now are pushing so hard that you pry your jaws apart. And so that was one failure mode for this gripper. It's 3D printed plastic, it's very compliant. But despite all of these challenges and the fact that this is very preliminary, we're able to hold on to real mesophotic coral samples with up to almost 60 newtons of force. It's quite a lot given this very cheap $10 3D printed design. And so the failure modes are usually shearing off the surface features. We need to explore what happens once we have goopy coral tissue there. And then also when the spines break, which was more what we saw in the field. So we've done 2 field experiments. One was with a handheld device. Some divers did some testing. We had our blue ROV that went down to the Caribbean. And then this upcoming March, we're going to Moorea. There's a Berkeley field station in French Polynesia. And at that point, we're hoping to have our breaking sampling mechanism ready. Hopefully, we have a fully integrated machine. And of course, the biologists are very concerned about, well, when you're handling these very fragile ecosystems, are you doing damage? And so we're going to work with them to understand the implications long-term of us actually handling these reefs. Okay. So then the very final project is this glove. And it's designed to help people with spinal cord injury. And once again, look at features of compliance and how we've designed it into this machine. So the motivation is that there are a lot of people with spinal cord injury living in the United States alone. And for people who have tetraplegia, which is some degree of paralysis in the hands and arms, if you survey them, they say that regaining some function of the hands and arms is one of their top priorities. This is on the same level as, let's say, urinary and bowel function, right? So this is a very basic human capability that is really valued. And there have been a number of gloves that have been designed. So here are some recent ones. You can see they're like 2017 to 2019. And I believe that all of them have at least stated that spinal cord injury could be one potential application. Most of them have a lot of compliance, softness, some interesting linkages, and interesting actuators. Now, this is in the context of commercially available gloves and other sorts of hand orthotics. And basically 45% of people with spinal cord injury say they essentially never use their device. So there's this big gap between what's available now and what people need. So this is the design that we came up with. It's a sheet of spring steel that goes across the dorsal part of the hand to the back of the hand. We've got a distal flexure here. There's a rigid support. That rigid support is this portion right here. So it goes across the bottom part of the fingers. And it's a very sparse design. And so this palm glove, which supports the thumb and also protects and adds friction to the palm here, this device can be put on top of this. And this is a very, very common device that people use. And when we tested this on a small number of healthy individuals, asking them not to flex their hands, they grasped an average of up to an average of 20 newtons of force. So that's a pretty strong grip. Yeah. Okay, so how do we distribute compliance on this device? When we first started, we wanted this to be extremely simple, but we realized very quickly that a cantilever beam that's being actuated by the tip is going to bend the most at the base. Right? And so we needed to add an extra joint here in order to increase the curling of the fingers. But what we did find is that this placement along the fingers was very natural. So when you had a new subject put on the glove, they sort of naturally fit it to themselves and it worked pretty well. So it was relatively agnostic to individual variations in finger length or hand size. And one other really important element of this is dawnability. So when we look back at what are those new devices that are being developed, well, they've got some really awesome new actuators, and they are really great as research devices, but how is a person with a limp hand, with a paralyzed hand, supposed to put on a glove? When I put on gloves, I stiffen my fingers and I grab onto it with my other hand like this. So how are you supposed to do that without assistance? So in this device, we really focused on having this open surface on the base where somebody could hook their fingers very easily and push it on, and then it's pretty much in place, except for maybe 2 straps that you could do with your teeth. So this was a really important element. That said, we haven't characterized dawnability yet for this device, and in fact, that's not a super well-defined parameter. And then, of course, how do we control this? We have a motor that's opening and closing the hands. How does the operator tell the device when it wants to open and close? So there's this behavior called tenodesis grasping. It has to do with the fact that the tendons that open and close your fingers also go past your wrist. So when they elongate across your wrist, your fingers naturally close. And you can actually try this. So if you have your hand sort of down, your wrist down like this, and you flex your wrist up, it takes a little bit more effort to do this than it would just to let your fingers curl up. All right, so that's tenodesis grasping. And when somebody's new to spinal cord injury, if they just had one, this is an approach that's actually taught as a strategy, a compensatory strategy in order to grasp very small objects. The problem is you're now coupling wrist motion to finger motion. And if you have a constraint, a motion constraint at your end effector, that's going to influence the rest of your arm. So if I want to grip onto this object, I have to actually move my whole body, right? I can't just open and close my fingers. So we decided, again, this is a hypothesis, that people with spinal cord injury would find wrist flexion as an intuitive way to open and close the device. And I think that that's something that we need to test, but we'll see whether that's true or not. But when we ask people who are healthy, who don't have spinal cord injury to do this, you can see they're a little clumsy. So what's next? We just got our first IRB approved to actually work with individuals with spinal cord injury. I'm really excited for that because I think it's just going to be a tremendous opportunity to learn. And so we've got a lot of studies planned for that. And in part, so I showed you this study before, the principal component analysis. Pretty much most of these studies that are characterizing human grasping work with a healthy subject pool. They don't necessarily work with people who have alternative ways of doing dexterous manipulation. So part of this is going to be recharacterizing what does dexterity mean for different individuals. Okay, and then I also teach an augmenting human dexterity course in which I learn a lot and the students learn a lot. And I do want to say that this work was actually done by all people not in my lab. I borrowed students from a different lab, from Professor Tamazuka's lab, the MSc lab. But you can look it up in 2 publications. Okay, whew, I went at light speed. So this summarizes the projects that I've been a part of. And I've showed you sort of where my thesis led to, and there's still a couple open questions there. And then some new areas of research that I think have just a lot of potential for growth. And the main takeaway is that when you're designing mechanisms for the real world, you really do have to consider compliance don't just go with a fully rigid machine because it's not going to break. There are ways to make compliant machines not break and still be very useful. And then also contact conditions can make all the difference. I have a great lab. There's a lot of stuff to come in the pipeline. The work of the spine gripper was Monica, and Michael Abbott helped out with the suction tactile sensing, but they are also doing other projects, and there's a number of first-year students who have another set of projects going on. And so hopefully if I gave a talk here in another year, there'd be a whole set of new projects to present. So it's a really exciting time in Edge. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. This is so this is not published work. It's actually classwork. Some students were designing prosthetic hands for a kid named Theo, who was born without the distal part of his arm after the elbow. And so these are devices that were built for him. Yeah.
I'm curious about the suction sensing. So for Ocean One, if I remember well, a lot of the operation was the operation, and a big part of this was haptic feedback.
Sure.
Do you think it will be possible to give any sort of haptic feedback on suction? That seems like a weird modality to try to transfer to your operator, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You could imagine just mapping it one-to-one. So let's say the person had a little suction cup that contacted their finger, I guess. That might be an intuitive way to sense suction engagement. That would be kind of a cool setup to try. But like I'm saying, so if you're able to correlate your sensor information with some other information that's helpful, such as pull-out force, you could use that external force measurement and portray that back. In this case, for Ocean One, it would be redundant because Ocean One has a load cell at the wrist. So really that study was more proof of concept, but a lot of robots do have load cells. So I think probably what you would instead use it for is maybe for internal forces or some other sort of interaction that you can't measure with your load cell. Yeah, but I think it would be fun to hook up little suction cups on a person and see how it is. I don't know if there's any. I'm sure there are suction style haptic displays out there. I just don't know them. Yeah.
Also in regards to the suction, like you mentioned, like it's not a suction cup, and like show that sometimes a bigger pump doesn't help, but would it be helpful, do you think, to like make a little rubber ring around it and try and make it a suction cup if you could?
Yeah, thank you. I glossed over this. We did find, even with the tactile sensor, that a soft skin was extremely helpful. So you imagine, okay, you're gonna get the most force when you're clogged. And in that circumstance, it's gonna be acting like a suction cup. So if you're just trying to grip onto or palm an object, your best case scenario will be a full seal. So if you have that, fantastic. And we kind of do that. I would say it's a little bit less sensitive to bumps and grooves on the surface. So if you have a slightly porous object, a suction cup won't be able to seal, but we will still be able to pull a pressure differential. So I say that the fact that it's a flow rate doesn't negate the suction cup element. It almost expands it into a new regime. So yeah, and the sensor, so if you don't have a soft skin, any little misalignment is going to create a really large flow. If you create a really soft skin, you're going to be able to halfway clog your orifice over a much larger range of contact orientations. And so it's a really helpful element for sensing. Yeah, because without the skin, you could just miss contact altogether. Yeah.
I'm curious if there are considerations dealing with the fact that you're in seawater. Like, do you have trouble housing motors in a containment where it works well? And I don't know if you've thought about using maybe soft actuators, but maybe they don't hold up well in seawater. Like
Yeah, I do think that there have been some people who have tried exploring different sorts of actuators underwater. So shape memory alloy, for example, I think it was used in a little fish robot, but the problem is when it's in water, it starts bubbling and weird things happen. So yeah, definitely being exposed to water will change your thermal properties, your conductive properties, a lot of elements. And then even in the ocean, when you go deep, your pressure. So usually when you see in these robots, it's something that's insensitive to pressure. So you've got incompressible materials or some sort of differential pressure mechanism. And then sealing electrical motors is really common just because the materials can corrode. But so for Ocean 1, it's an oil-filled cavity because if you had air, it might like collapse at large depths. So yeah, motors can run in oil. And actually some brushless motors, if you treat the materials right, can just run in water. But again, you have that long-term aging effect that might be an issue. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, for the coral gripper, that I saw that the testing was happening on air with the sample of it. Was there any difference in the air and the underwater behavior of the gripper?
We didn't explicitly test that yet. I have an undergraduate researcher trying to figure out how to keep corals alive in our labs so we can actually test it with like the real tissue properties. My best guess is that, yeah, it has to do with like having this slimy tissue there. Might be really different than like dry, bare coral. Also, the coral might just be more brittle when it's been dried out. I'm not sure exactly how the coral itself changes underwater, but my guess is that's going to be the biggest change. Yeah, because the spine behavior is pretty much static. I don't think that should change too much. Yeah.
Thank you. You did do an experiment with a coral underwater in that one. You said that a diver went down.
Yeah.
What was the damage that you observed from that coral during that?
Yeah, so they didn't report. So that was a biologist doing it. So we weren't able to go and like observe it up close, I guess, ourselves.
Okay.
They just tested it to see if it would grip on and kind of just like pulled it loosely. So it was a very preliminary test.
Okay.
And that's why we're trying to get corals in the lab so we can actually test it
You're saying,
as well as, yeah.
did they not bring it to land like that during that imaging where it's kind of, he's like shaking out the dirt? It looks like he did raise it up, but did he just leave it there?
Yeah, so that's just a plate that they found. That was not coral. So we had, I had other videos with coral, but they're just not as good. So I showed you the random plate that we found. But I think it's, yeah, no, that's fine. I think I found it was cool because it was like we weren't planning on picking up that object. We had no really a priori knowledge of that being there, and yet they just saw it and wanted to pick it up, and it worked. So I guess to me it was cool because I knew the context, but yeah. Yeah.
When dealing with a object that has like user like biofilm on it, like do you have an issue with anything getting stuck in the tubes, or like does that affect like your head loss calculations or anything like that?
Good. Yeah, I get this question almost every talk, so I was just waiting for somebody to figure out. Yeah, that's going to be a problem, right? You're going to suck up sand and goop and stuff, right? There are a couple strategies we could take. So if we're able to reverse flow, if we're measuring flow rate and we detect a clog that we know is in contact, we could reverse the flow and like evacuate it out. And you kind of see fish do that. Like they'll suck stuff in. Sometimes they'll like spit it back out. So I mean, that could work. There's also other strategies where I think the scaling is not advantageous for this amount of flow. But when people are excavating at shipwrecks, what they do is they essentially pump water through a tube, which creates a negative suction force this way. And so while your pump is up here, the goop goes up and then this way. So you never actually draw fluid from the environment through your pump. So that's a potential strategy. And then there's other things people do, like kind of have these big chambers where your goop will come and settle, then your pump's up top. So there's like a lot of different strategies that you could go about making sure that the stuff doesn't become a problem. But that's certainly like, yeah, that's a really important practical detail. Yeah.
So going back to the coral gripper, is it just rigidly attached to the diver?
Yeah.
So is there anything that you plan to do to, because you mentioned it's hard to control, so if it's to lift or rotate or something?
Yeah, so we're kind of waiting to hear what the resolution is going to be for the guys doing the control of the ROV, because we now have the same one, and so we're sort of sharing code and hardware. It's sounding to me like in the vertical displacement, they're going to be able to get within a small number of centimeters, actually, with visual feedback, because you're close to a substrate, so you can get very good detection of motion with a camera. So we're actually thinking it's going to be okay without adding more degrees of freedom, an arm or something. But there has been work on like space gripping and stuff where like a flexible wrist or some sort of damped transmission can be really helpful. And I do think eventually what we could have is like, hopefully you can anchor your anchor in a very robust fashion and then still let your robot kind of swim around as it needs. So yeah, I could definitely see us decoupling in some way. But as of now, we're kind of just waiting to see what really is going to be the need. Yeah.
Awesome, so let's thank our speaker.